Hello everyone, it's great to see you. And before we get started, I'd like to say that if you like this video, please like the video. It means so much to me, I would really greatly appreciate it. And subscribe, would love to have you in this little community and hang out, chat games, and so on. And today the game we're going to talk about is Full Spectrum Warrior, developed by Pandemic Studios, one of my favorites, and published by THQ. This is a 2004 release, and it's a real-time tactics game, which is pretty interesting, and it's a squad-based shooter type of game as well. One that was, of this era, there was a lot of them, so to speak. The first one that comes to mind is the Conflict series, the Desert Storm, Vietnam, Global Terror, I think is the other one. But Full Spectrum Warrior plays much closer to a strategy game, and the game has a very interesting development history. And so before we go into that, I'll just show you, of course, we have the front title, which you've seen, and then we have this nice back side. I actually like the orange on here quite a bit. Nothing too particularly interesting happening on the back. But you will notice that it says right here, it's based on a training aid developed for the US Army. I think it's pretty interesting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we also have the instruction manual. As you can see, it just kind of has the same art style as the front. And this thing's actually a thick boy. Thick boy. Okay, but what's in here? Let's see. There's a little bit of information about the mount, I guess. I don't know. And it tells a little bit about the soldiers that you'll play as. And there's 8 soldiers here, so they all have pretty lengthy biographies, and you get a whole layout of what's going on, the mission, and so on and so forth. And a little bit about how the game works, and it's actually a very, very in-depth looking manual here. I should have dug through it a little more before talking about the game, but we'll at least cover some of the mission overview stuff. So, before we do that, I have some of the story in my head here. Let's talk about the development, because that was actually the most interesting part of this whole game, I think, in my mind personally. So, the US Army, back in the early 2000s, were exploring commercial gaming platforms as a way to train. You know, a big part of it being that Xbox and PS2 was cheap, kind of overall, and could serve as a cheap way to train soldiers on tactics, combat, etc. And by the 2000s, you know, a lot of recruits coming into the Army were also familiar already with the gaming software and the controllers and so on and so forth. And so they started working with Sony and Pandemic Studios on something called Project C4, which was basically set up as a way to explore a game or something that could accomplish these objectives. And so ultimately, Full Spectrum Warrior was kind of a byproduct of these experiments. And when Pandemic was exploring the title and working on it for the US Army, they said to themselves, hey, this could also serve as a good entertainment kind of point. And so while we are working on this training sim, let's take the training sim and kind of develop it into a game. And so that's where we got Full Spectrum Warrior from. Now, the funny thing about this whole story is that, to my understanding, there was critical opinions from the US Army on the training sim. Apparently, the training sim never even really got used for training purposes, which I thought was pretty funny. But we did get this game out of it, and it went on to win a number of achievements and awards. It won at the Game Critics Awards in 2003, both Best Simulation Game and Best Original Game, which I think that when we'll talk about it a little bit, the idea was in fact quite original. It was also nominated for Best Strategy Game by XPlay in 2004, rest in peace, XPlay. And so that's a little bit about the development and the history of the game. So let's talk about that story that I was mentioning. So the story is, it's the 2000s. So it's 2004, the game's coming out, so they're developing it in 2003. Well, this is, of course, right around the invasion in Iraq. And so if you have some familiarity with kind of where we're at the timeline, then you'll understand kind of what this game's perspective was when it was setting up a scenario on which to base it. And so there's essentially a string of terrorist attacks in the Western world, and they prompt the invasion by the U.S. and coalition forces into a fictional country, Zekistan, in Central Asia. And Zekistan's ruled by a dictator, Alafad, and he's basically just inviting terrorists to come to Zekistan and train to do terrorism, essentially. And so you'll follow these two fire teams, Alpha and Bravo is what they're aptly named, and we looked at, there's 4 soldiers in each squad, and they all have these backstories and so on. But you eventually, essentially go to Zekistan as these fire teams with the objective of kind of, from the moment you land, working through these streets of Zekistan, securing an airport for reinforcements, infiltrating Alafad's palace, capturing him. That kind of goes wrong. A plane crashes, you save the plane people, and then you go back to attempting to stop Alafad. That's about it. The story is pretty straightforward. You receive the story through a series of kind of just dialogue points between each mission. There's 11 missions. As you complete them, you'll get some new objective, or you'll be in a somewhat new area that you're kind of working through. And that's about that. I mean, it's as generic as you would expect a game of this time for this purpose to be. And so I was never really gripped by the story or where it was going. And they kind of tried, I guess. There's a couple of Shyamalami twists when you're going after Alafad, I guess I would say. But yeah, the story was okay. That's about where I'll leave it for the story. But where the game really gets original, creative, and interesting, and for the reasons it won the awards it did, was in its gameplay. And so at the start of each mission, you know, you'll have these 2 fire teams, and from there, you know, what I usually would do is check the GPS, and in the GPS you can see a real-time map, which is pretty interesting, that looks like something like a spy satellite would have taken an image of. And on that map you'll see an objective where you need to go, and you can kind of start to get an idea of like, okay, there's alleys here, there's a roadway here, what would be the best way for us to move the soldiers through these environments in order to keep them safe and protected. And so once you note the objective and you note some pathways, you'll then begin making your way there. And you have limited intelligence along the way. So of course there's going to be combatants that you have to fight. And the only perspective you really have is you can call a recon occasionally using your GPS. But really the perspective you're playing this from is from the squad leader's perspectives. And so you'll never know exactly where the combatants are, and you'll have to make your way slowly around corners, peek through, or perhaps sometimes they're on roofs and things like that. And so from a strategy perspective, the game starts to get really interesting when you are engaging with enemies. Each of the fire teams has 4 soldiers that have 4 kind of specialties. And so you'll have the squad leader who has a standard M4, you'll have a machine gunner, you'll have a gunner with a carbine rifle, and one that has a grenade launcher. And so you can utilize these skills in different ways to deal with enemies as they come along your path. One of the most encouraging tactics that the game employs is you have your 2 squads, and you'll set one up, say, behind a barrier, and you'll employ them to lay down suppressive fire on where some enemies are. And the way that this strategy kind of works is that if you're behind a barrier and your enemy's behind a barrier, you're both defending, or you both have a little defensive icon over your head, and so that essentially shows that they can't be damaged while they're in cover of that nature. But if you were to lay suppressive fire down on them, it's going to be really hard for them to maneuver anywhere, and you can utilize your other squad, for instance, to flank around and find a better positioning in which to shoot and take that combatant out. There are also occasions where you'll have access to grenades, or you have your grenade launcher, of course, and you can use these to, again, take out enemies depending on the circumstance and so on. But a lot of the times I found myself utilizing the former strategy I mentioned in order to take care of enemies because it proved to be the most effective. In the tactics realm, this is most of the game. You will experience these in varying levels of difficulty. Also, things like grenades and bullets and so on for your weapons are limited in nature. And so there is a theoretical world in which you could run out and find yourself in a bad situation. However, I didn't really experience that when playing through the game. I felt like I had way more resources than I needed to. And the game even points out, hey, these are limited resources, so be careful. And so what really ended up happening is I just forgot to use, say, the grenades a lot of the time because I always expected myself to be in a circumstance later down the road where I would need them more. And so that did limit me on kind of exploring the ways in which the game could change depending on the tactics in which you use as a player. But overall, I did really enjoy the dynamics of the gameplay because though it really comes down to pinning enemies, flanking them, and using your new leverage to take them out, I found it to be pretty difficult and at times challenging in proceeding forward, especially because if two soldiers from the same unit go down, you basically get a game over. And the soldiers are human and they're realistically portrayed, and so one or two bullets will take them down. And if that's the case, you have to carry your teammates out. That's how the US Army has designed its protocols. And so then you have kind of two soldiers out of the fight, which becomes difficult for you to proceed and move forward because now that unit is moving slower. They have two soldiers without weapons that can be used because one of them is carrying the other, and so on and so forth. Fortunately, throughout the levels, there will be stopping points where you can use case evacs, which will replenish your ammunitions and will give you an opportunity to heal. But essentially, if one of these soldiers goes down, you're going to have a very difficult time utilizing these abilities that I was talking about, such as flanking or in taking out enemies. And so you might resort to using more of the munitions you have, the grenades and so on and so forth. But overall, I did find that to be pretty engaging. I found it very hilarious when soldiers do go down because they end up, they have a ragdoll system in this game. And so sometimes when guys would get shot or whatever, they would just go, whoa, just fly into the air, all ridiculous, and do cartwheels and stuff. And I don't know if that was purposeful, but I did find it to be very enjoyable whenever it happened and did give me a good laugh. A couple other things I wanted to mention in the gameplay space is that the command and movement is pretty slow on at least consoles. I played this, of course, on the Xbox One through backwards compatibility. So the cursor is basically shows your squad setup, where your soldiers would go if you issued a command, and you use the left joystick to kind of move this around the map. And so once you've kind of positioned it, and it can be finicky at times, you want to make sure that you can see where all four soldiers will stand, because sometimes it'll like put a soldier out into the middle of a line of fire of an enemy, and then of course you get smoked right away. But you have to issue the command, and then the squad leader goes, okay, Alpha, go, and then you'll see the soldiers start to move. And the moments between issuing the commands and getting soldiers to actively move can be, pretty slow overall. And so when you are moving around territories, that can mean you're going to spend a lot of time moving the cursor very slowly and moving soldiers from a corner to a corner or barrier to another barrier. And that can become tedious overall in gameplay, especially since you have to do this for both squads. You cannot move Alpha and Bravo together, for instance. And I think that would have been something that would help the cohesion of the pacing of the game if you could say move Alpha and issue a command to say, hey, Bravo, come over to us. And it would be possible because the game does have a mechanic in which maybe you're not in cover, but an enemy pops up and you can hold down the cancel button to cancel a command. And what holding it down will do is it'll disperse your soldiers into cover. And so there are ways in which the game can automate some of this kind of cover and movement stuff that they decided not to, or maybe it didn't cross their minds, but would have been something I think would have been appreciative. But yeah, overall, I did really enjoy the gameplay. It's a short game. It'll only take maybe 8 hours to finish across these 11 levels. And it stays just long enough to keep it engaging with how kind of simplistic I think the game is from just like a interacting with the gameplay perspective overall. I did really like it, and I loved the strategy of it enough to say I wish we had games with this gameplay mechanic in the modern era of gaming. It would just be very interesting to see in real time with a little bit of cleanup and the kind of quality of life improvements that 20 years of game development would provide such a concept. And so that would be really fun. Overall, in the sound space, the game has pretty generic, just kind of like U.S. Army military sounding music, I guess. The voice acting is pretty solid. I mean, it works. It does what it needs to do. It happens between levels, and you just get missions issued to you from soldiers. They do only have a couple voice lines for the squad leaders, and so when they're saying, go Alpha, go, 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 go Alpha, go, like it really starts to become, again, a little repetitive. But one thing I thought was interesting is in scenarios where one of your soldiers does go down, say the squad leader is shot down, Pandemic was thoughtful enough to record cutscene moments, which happen real time, with whichever soldier usually takes backup for them. And so I thought that was just a really neat idea that they made sure that they were kind of being complete in the overall gaming experience. So I was impressed with that. And so I think the sound is serviceable. It does what it needs to do. And graphically, the game runs and looks pretty good on Xbox One. It obviously looks like a game from 2004, but I won't give it too much of an issue there because while it was ported over, I think just from a backwards compatibility sense, that running on my 4K TV, it still looked great. The enemies, the modeling, it does like kind of look blocky. It's been 20 years. And overall, the environments are not visually stimulating. From the first level to the 11th, you will be in Zekistan, which is this Middle Eastern or Central Asian country, and it's a big desert, and there's a lot of Middle Eastern style architecture, and really that's about it. There's not a whole lot interesting going on until perhaps later in the game when you're in a downtown area where a plane crash occurred. And so again, just kind of serviceable. It helps us get through the game. It visually represents, I guess, what you would anticipate if you were going into the Middle East in a combat situation. So, I mean, I can't really complain too much. And those are a lot of my thoughts about the game. I did enjoy playing Full Spectrum Warrior. I think most all what I thought was engaging was the concept of the game overall. And I'd love to see something in the modern era just kind of do this as it has been done here. I love real-time strategy games, but I've never considered the idea that you stick the camera behind someone's soldier or someone's shoulder on the battlefield as opposed to having a top-down view. And that perspective really changed the way in which you're moving through the environment and engaging with the world. The gameplay was pretty fun, though simple and repetitive in a lot of ways. It still maintained a challenge throughout, and it was fun to kind of interact with the experience overall. And while we're here in the gameplay section, I did want to pause and say as well that if you do get a game over, there's a really cool on the Xbox. I don't know about on PS2 or anything, because the Xbox had a hard drive and could do this, but you essentially get a full replay up to the game over moment. And so when you do have to replay a section, you can run through this replay and fast forward and jump right into it to then retry whatever specific portion you're working on. And I thought that was such an interesting concept that even if I did get a game over, I didn't feel too brokenhearted about it. And so very cool, to say the least. Navigating the world, a little repetitive at times, both in the audio aspects and also in moving Alpha and Bravo independently throughout even simple sections where maybe there's no enemies or anything like that. The sound is serviceable, the graphics are serviceable, and it does look pretty good, all things considered from a backwards compatibility lens. And so I think the game's pretty interesting. It's worth picking up and trying out, especially if you have an Xbox that'll run backwards compatibility. And that's all I really wanted to say. I appreciate you watching. Have you played Full Spectrum Warrior? Would love to know your thoughts about the game. And would also, again, just like to reiterate that if you liked the video, I would love if you did like the video. And again, subscribe. Would love to have you here. for the next video. All right, y'all. Well, I do appreciate you watching. I hope you take care, stay healthy, and look forward to seeing you next week in the next video. All right. Bye, guys.